The last topic is on species. We've used this word a lot today, and we've kind of used this, actually, the term a lot since this course basically started. So let's talk about what a species is. How do we define a species? What makes up a species? Before we get into that, it's important to understand that there's different levels of biological diversity. What is biodiversity or biological diversity? It is the variety of life across all levels of biological organization. So all it is the variety of life. The variety of life, put an extra C in there, the variety of a life across all levels of biological organization. So we can look at species, we can look at genes, we can look at the level of populations or communities. So scientists have described 1.8 million species. And we believe that there could be up to 100 million species that may exist, and we just don't know. One location that is extremely diverse is tropical rainforests or coral reefs. They have the highest biodiversity in the world. So first is coral reefs, and the second is tropical rainforests. All right, let's define a species. A species is a population or group of populations whose members share certain types of characteristics. Generally, when we see the term species, the definition that most books give you is a species is a group of interbreeding organisms. Now, the problem with that is interbreeding only gives a definition for organisms that breed sexually. But what about things that breed asexually, such as this here? These are organisms that breed asexually. Or what about organisms that are capable of interbreeding, but yet produce fertile offspring? Here on the left-hand image, we see a bobcat. Here on the right, we see a Canadian lynx. These are two different species, but when they cross and they produce an offspring, their offspring is actually fertile. It's not like a horse and a donkey making a mule and their offspring sterile. There's some examples where that definition just doesn't really fit. And when we looked at this picture, we said, okay, well, there's things that are asexual as far as their reproduction. And that definition really doesn't help us. So what's going on here? I see a sponge on the left, I see bacteria on the right, but asexual reproduction is producing a clone, whereas sexual reproduction is genetic mixing. So asexual reproduction produces a clone, and an example of asexual reproduction would be budding or binary fission. So now, how do we define a species? Let's erase this and put that here. Okay. Our definition of a species is a group of living organisms. A species is a group of living organisms with similar characteristics. Similar characteristics, morphology, and ecological niche. They consisting of genetically similar individuals hate how that goes away every now and then. Let's go back. Of course, mid-definition, that would go blank. So let's say it again. A species is a group of living organisms. A group of living, sorry about that. A group of living organisms with similar characteristics, morphology. Morphology means appearance, and ecological niche. Ecological niche means their niche is their role in the environment, consisting of genetically similar individuals that are capable of inheriting genes from a parent or two parents, or interbreeding, to produce fertile offspring. All right, so that's a little bit of a long definition, but it includes all those parts of a species that are really important. I will never ask you to regurgitate that definition, but what I would expect you to know is the different criteria if I were to ask you it. So here we're seeing a realm of different species and how different species have different morphology, characteristics, genetics, and here we're seeing some diversity at the species level. All right, let's talk about species diversity. Species diversity is the number, let's say, the number or variety of species in a particular region. We have something called richness. This is purely just the number of species. How many different species do we have in this particular rainforest? 330. That's how many different ones. But another factor that's important with species diversity is something called evenness. And this is essentially the relative abundance. This is the extent to which species differ in the number of individuals. Meaning, let me give you an example. I walk into a field and I see 3 different wildflowers, and that's it. I see tulips, I see daisies, and I see roses. 1, 2, 3. That means my richness is 3. I go into another field and I see 3 of the same species, or I see 3 different species. So my species richness, I see tulips, I see roses, and I see daisies. So here, same thing. My species richness is 3. But now, as far as my evenness, it's looking at how many. So let's say in my first community, I see only 2 daisies, and I see 300 daisies. Or, I'm sorry, let me go back. There's in field 1 and field 2 both have 3 species total that we have. There is 300 individuals in each field. But in field 1, I see 2 daisies. And then I see, I don't know, 51 tulips. And then the remainder of them, the 247 remainder is all the last species of, I forgot what I named, tulips, daisies, and roses. The last one is tulips. And I see a huge difference in the number. But then in my last field, field 2, I see 100 daisies, I see 100 tulips, and 100 roses. The evenness, the number of how many individuals of each species is more similar. So that would be a higher species diversity because it has this closer evenness. So speciation is the process of generating new species. We know extinction reduces the species richness, but speciation creates them. So here, speciation is the process of generating new species from a single species. The process of generating new species from a single species. So it's the process where one species splits into two or more different species. Allopatric speciation is the most common form of speciation, and this is just when species form as a result of some kind of physical separation. Species form as a result of physical separation. Physical separation of populations. So this is the main mode. We could have populations being separated by glaciers, by rivers, or mountains. So each population with its own set of mutations basically diverge. On the right-hand side, we see an example. We see one single population of squirrels. Number 2, we see that the land has flooded and has been covered, and now we have 2 genetically or geographically isolated populations. Now what happens is they are no longer interbreeding because they can't get to one another. So they develop their own mutations. They become different species. And then the last image, now the water receded, and now they can intermix, but they no longer produce fertile offspring together. Now they are 2 separate species. Here we see the same thing. We had an early fox population. Some went north, some went south, and we developed the Arctic fox and then the gray fox. Different species, no longer one species due to geographic isolation. All right, so speciation results in different life forms. I mentioned that term phylogenetic trees before. I mentioned that this is a nice way of basically seeing common ancestors. So a phylogenetic tree is a branching diagram that shows relationships among species or groups. A branching diagram. These are branching diagrams that show relationships that show relationships among species, groups, or even genes. So it represents life's history. So here I can see, lampreys are a primitive fish. They didn't have a jaw. So once we started developing jaws, we see a branch called sharks. Then sharks started, or common ancestors started developing lungs or swim bladder. So then we had bony fish. And then we had forelegs. And then that developed into amphibians. Then we had an ancestor with feathers. And then we got birds from there. So you can see the relationship. So bony fish are more closely related to sharks than turtles would be to bony fish. Here's another example of a phylogenetic tree, but this one is nice because it has those 6 different kingdoms of life. So we see kingdom bacteria, kingdom archaea, kingdom protists, plants, fungi, and animals. So we see that, okay, animals are more closely related to fungus than they are to a protist. Right, so this kind of gives you a nice little example here. All right, as far as taxonomy, taxonomy is the classification of species. Classification of species. Classification of species. A taxonomist, then, is a scientist who classifies species into different groups. Every species has a 2-part scientific name. So instead of calling humans humans, we give a human a scientific name, Homo sapiens. Or a red oak is not called a red oak everywhere in the world, but everywhere in the world it's called Quercus rubra. So this 2-part scientific name is universal throughout the world. So if I was in the US right now, and then next week I were going to, Russia, and I said Quercus rubra, some other scientists would know what I'm talking about. They wouldn't know what I was talking about if I said red oak, but if I said the scientific name, they would. So the scientific name consists of the genus and species. And we call this 2-name system binomial nomenclature. So here on the bottom, we could see the scientific name for the tiger, Panthera tigris. That's an example. Now what happens with taxonomy is that we start really, really broad, and then we start subdividing it into more specific categories. We have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Those are the several subdivisions of life. Now, we have different domains. We have eukarya, we have archaea, we have bacteria. We have different kingdoms, archaea, protists, so on, animal, plants. And then we have different phylums. We have different classes. We have different orders. We have different families, but it's just the subcategories. So what happens here is if we're trying to classify a tiger, we look at something really broad. We say, okay, they're a eukaryote because their cell has a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They're in the animal kingdom. They're not plants. They're not going to be a fungus or a protist. The next thing is they're chordata. They basically have a backbone. Then they're mammals, right? They're mammals. They have fur. They give birth to live young. They are going to produce or have mammary glands and produce milk. Then they're in the order Carnivora, right? They're in the order with all the meat eaters. And then they're in the family of cats, Felidae, and then the genus of leopards and lions and tigers, right? So that makes sense as far as the division, hopefully. Here is another example of the same thing. We have the really broad category domain on the right, all the way down to species. A good way to remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and the sequence of this is by Dr. King Philip came over for good spaghetti. All right, so you might see that on an exam. Make sure you understand those differences of those levels. Here, I always like showing this image because we're talking about species and we're talking about relationships. How do we know a certain species is related to another? We gave the definition of a species. Sometimes we want to look at a species and just by its morphology, we think, oh, that must be in this family or this closest relative must be this. Here we're seeing a hyrax. A hyrax kind of looks like a groundhog, looks like some kind of rodent, right? So we might, by just looking at it, say, oh, it must be related to that. But instead, the closest living relative for the hyrax is actually the elephant. So here, we have to use genetics in order to figure out, wow, this looks like nothing like the elephant at all. But it's genetically closely related to the elephant compared to other groups. All right, so that's it on that particular topic.